Next, on Book TV's Afterwards, Muslim American federal agent Tamer Elnoury discusses his experience fighting domestic terrorism in America. He's interviewed by Michael German, author of Thinking Like a Terrorist, Insights of a Former FBI Undercover Agent. He's also a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. Because of his undercover work, Mr. Elnoury's identity is hidden behind a screen, and his voice has been altered.
Hi, my name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School and a former FBI agent. And today it's my great pleasure to talk to Tamer Elnoury about his new book, American Radical: Inside the World of an Undercover Muslim FBI Agent. And Tamer, I think I want to start by having you explain why it is that you have to speak from behind a screen.
Well, thanks for having me, Mike. The reason, obviously, is because of the fact that I am still an active covert operative for the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. My identity, even if I wasn't still active, is sensitive and should never be revealed, obviously.
Okay, great. And I think that's what makes your book so unusual. A lot of FBI undercover agents, after they retire, have gone out and written memoirs. All of those have to go through a screening process at the FBI before they're allowed to be published. But what made you want to write the book while you were still working undercover?
Yeah, I get that a lot from within the organization and outside the organization. And it's a great question, but the truth is, it's, I guess, a bit of a perfect storm. First off, one of my international terrorism cases was declassified for trial, so that gave me an opportunity to be a voice for those that don't have one. I have a unique perspective, as you are aware, into a world that most Americans know little about. I'm also hoping to honor the brave men and women of the FBI who combat terrorism every day to keep our country safe.
And why don't you tell me a little bit, as much as you can, about your backstory, how you got into law enforcement, how you got into undercover work, how you got into the FBI?
Yes, I was born in Egypt, came to the States when I was young. I was 4.5 years old. I speak Arabic like I speak English. I'm Sunni Muslim. I grew up in the Northeast, New Jersey, New York area, and I went into law enforcement right out of college. I worked undercover narcotics for 12 years, and after the events of 9/11, I wanted to dedicate the rest of my career and life to combating this evil in terrorism.
And you mentioned in the book that when you first approached the FBI, they weren't very responsive. Obviously, that was in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, so you can imagine they were pretty busy. But when you finally did hook up with an FBI recruiter, one of the things he suggested to you was that it was difficult for the FBI to get people who have Arabic language skills through the FBI's undercover school. Why do you think that was? Or was that just a recruiting tool trying to give you one more reason to join?
No. The recruiter basically explained to me that, especially in law enforcement, there's obviously many different tentacles that you can do in various forms, as you are well aware, within the law enforcement community. You could be SWAT, you could work certain bank robberies, violent crimes. There's all kinds of different avenues you can take, but the undercover skill set was a bit rare to find. Not everybody has it, and it's not necessarily, it doesn't make you a good cop, bad cop, it just makes you different. Some guys have a niche for doing undercover work, but so you're already working with a smaller pool to choose from. Throw in the language skills, the cultural skills, religion, so your pool's even less. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time, and thankfully with the right skill set to be able to do this work.
And when you were still working in law enforcement before you came to the FBI, what attracted you to undercover work?
You know, I worked on a fugitive task force. I worked a lot more overt type law enforcement work when you're more out in the field. And I loved it and it intrigued me, but it just didn't have the same grab to me as working undercover. I started off making a lot of mistakes. I definitely knew I had a lot to learn. And to be honest with you, after the first couple of years doing undercover drug work, it's actually only by the grace of God that I made it through alive. I made a lot of cardinal mistakes. So I learned on the job, but I loved it. It was challenging to me every day, crafting backstories, figuring out my subjects, getting them to confide in you. It's a different type of adrenaline. It's a different type of work.
And that rings true to me. I worked with a lot of state and local law enforcement officers who worked undercover and was kind of shocked to see how little training they received before they were put out there, and particularly in something like drug cases, that's particularly dangerous. How do you feel about the training that you got before you came to the FBI, and then maybe describe the FBI's training as you can?
Oh, you're spot on, Mike. That's the absolute truth. Undercover work at the state and local levels is a sink or swim type endeavor. You either get it or you don't, and unfortunately, the training, although over the years I've seen get much better, back when I first started doing it, there wasn't much available. But the FBI has taken it to a whole new level. I've worked with agencies across the globe, different countries, law enforcement and intelligence agencies from all over the world, and there is absolutely nothing that compares to the FBI undercover program. Absolutely second to none. And the reason for it is, yes, the training, but the backstopping, the elaborate commitment to these legends that our undercovers portray. And it really gives us multiple tools to be able to do the job, regardless if it's criminal or national security.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I saw in it was that the people who did the work, the agents who were actually active undercover agents, were always willing to come back to provide that training, to be there as counselors. I hope that's still the case. I'm sure it is.
It is absolutely the case, and it is the strongest fraternity, brotherhood and sisterhood in law enforcement that I have ever encountered. I could be operational on the East Coast, call a friend of mine in LA and say, hey, I need a guy to step in and play this cameo for me. I need you to represent yourself to be X, Y, and Z. And he or she would be on the next flight out to help assist. And that's what we do. We support each other. We always have each other's backs, and we all always make time to come back to the school to train.
Great. So when you got brought in, now you had been in law enforcement for more than a decade, and in fact doing some pretty hazardous and detailed work. I think you say in one part of the book about 2,500 different drug buys. So you were very experienced. Did you have to go back through the FBI Academy?
No. At that stage, I was able to get brought into the Joint Terrorism Task Force. After all my clearances came through, I was able to go right to the FBI undercover school, and I hit the ground running.
Wow. And how long, typically with, at least the way that the rules were when I was working undercover, you had to have 4 years as an FBI agent before you started working undercover, but that's no longer, or didn't apply to you just because of the wealth of your experience?
I'm not so sure if it was the wealth of the experience or if it was a combination of that with the language skills that I had, my knowledge of the religion, and the current need for that skill set. So it might have been just a combination.
Right. And did you find it was difficult picking up on the paperwork and kind of the rules? Because that was sort of why they wanted you to have that work prior.
Yes, the paperwork, yes. And you know what? They've every case agent I've ever worked with in every division, every legal attache's office, they've all gone out of their way to help me with all of this stuff because, if you remember, the paperwork was always lengthy.
Mm-hmm. And did you ever feel that there was any discrimination against you because of your background or any other reason? I know that there have been some other complaints from other Muslim and Arab agents over the years.
How do you mean, as far as within
the FBI? Or within law enforcement in general?
No, I can honestly tell you that quite the opposite.
Good.
I will say that this much, that sometimes when you have a particular skill set, you could be adept to infiltrating bikers or drug dealers or gun runners or terrorists. And sometimes, and what I always tell students at the FBI undercover school is don't believe the hype about yourself. So don't become the diva that says, I need this kind of car, or I need this particular apartment, or don't be the person that isn't a cog on a wheel, isn't a part of a team, no matter how good or successful you may be doing undercover work. So I will go one step further to answer your question and say, I've always been treated extremely well, and almost the other end of the spectrum, too well.
Mm-hmm. There's a program called the Post-Adjudication Risk Management Program, which basically the way it works is most agents go through a background reinvestigation every 5 years, but if you were born abroad, you have to go through that every year, pretty much constantly. Has that been something that has applied to you at all? Or?
No, it's never applied to me. I follow the 5-year rule.
Yeah, okay, great. So tell me, well, number one, the how the book got written. Your co-author is Kevin Maurer, who has written other books. How did he reach out to you? Because you're working in alias and your name isn't, your real name isn't known. How did he get in touch with you, or how did the book come about?
Well, the book came about. It's actually quite the funny story. Once I decided that I wanted to get this message out for personal and professional reasons, my first phone call was to FBI headquarters and the pre-publication unit and the security division. I wanted to dot every I and cross every T because I wanted this book to be done. I wanted to be an open book, no pun intended, moving forward. And I wanted to follow all the rules to be able to publish it because I wasn't looking to give someone an insight into a world that they weren't allowed to have. I didn't want any backlash. I wanted to do this completely within the FBI's purview. So once I got the outline as to how to move forward writing the book, and I got permission to start, I reached out to Joe Pistone, a.k.a. Donnie Brasco, who was one of my instructors at the FBI undercover school. I asked him how to go about doing it, and he set me up with my agent, Frank Wyman. Frank, in turn, reached out to the publisher at Dutton, who he arranged a meeting, met with him for about an hour and a half, and shortly thereafter we had a contract. A couple weeks later, and the publisher then called me and said, I have just the guy that you should talk to. He's going to sign a non-disclosure before he even gets on the phone with you, and I think you'll love him. And boy, was he right. Kevin and I are very good friends now that we spent the last year and a half talking, probably more than I've talked to anyone in my family or friends. We spent a lot of time together, and he is not only a brilliant author, he's a remarkable journalist. He has a very special skill set that I was very impressed to learn and see. Number one, his process was amazing. Difficult, arduous, but amazing. But two, he had a knack for when he was interviewing me and talking to me, to be able to capture my voice, but also to put me in a spot where that particular chapter was taking place. He would ask me about certain foods that we were eating or where we were, who was there, and he managed to be able to draw on my memories and put me back in that situation so brilliantly. It was again, an amazing skill set. I love the way he sees the world, and I love the way he writes. And I'm very, very fortunate that I got to work with him on this project.
And the book does actually put you in the place. As you said, those details are very helpful. And I think what I'm sure is your sense of humor rather than his comes through quite a bit through the the book. As far as the why, you mentioned that there were things going on, and there have been a number of different periods of time. There, when I was working at the ACLU, there were some counterterrorism training materials that we obtained from the FBI through the Freedom of Information Act that reflected a strong anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bias. And of course, over the course of the last presidential campaign, there was a lot of anti-Muslim animus expressed by President Trump, and of course a Muslim ban. And you touch on that in the book. Is that what was driving why you wanted or what was driving why you were deciding that you needed to come out with this now?
Yeah, I think, Mike, you know what, you touched on generally, but let me be a little bit more specific. As a professional doing what I do, the things that you hear in the news and people's comments, you have to kind of let that slide. I mean, we see articles all the time that I would love to be able to answer to about the job that we do, but we're not allowed to do that. That's not what we do, and we don't talk about what we do, generally. But this time it was different. I was working at the FBI office one night, and there was a news program on, and it was on the heels of an ISIS attack over in Europe. And one of the broadcasters asked the question, how many millions of Muslim Americans are there in the U.S.? Why aren't they standing up more often to denounce terrorism? And for some reason, that one stuck. I've been very good at overlooking anything and everything, but that one stuck in my craw. So you know what? I'm raising my hand, and this American Muslim is. An American radical isn't just about religion. It's obviously got the backdrop of a deep cover international terrorism case, but it's a deep dive into the terrorist mindset and how they warp the religion for political reasons, how they change it. And it's a deep dive into 3 different terrorist mindsets. So it was imperative for me, because I had a platform, and if this is my 15 minutes, then here I am. And if I'm here today, I'm not speaking on behalf of the FBI, I'm not speaking on behalf of any intelligence agency, and I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody but myself. But I would like to say that I hope and pray that I am speaking on behalf of the millions of Muslim Americans and the 1.7 billion across the globe that don't think radically. I want them to feel comfortable and stand up and say, that is not the religion. That is what's being warped by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They're not the only ones with a voice anymore, and that's my goal, Mike.
Yeah, and I thought you said it very well towards the end of the book. If you don't mind me reading just a couple of sentences.
Of course.
Keeping America's doors open ensures that when we are threatened by an enemy, we will always have someone who looks like them to help defeat them. Our best defense is inclusion. America is everyone. And obviously, if your family had been denied entry into the United States way back when, you wouldn't have been available to be doing the kind of work that you're doing. So I think that is really a very well placed thought, and I appreciate you're going ahead and coming out with the book now. You have another line where you talk about sort of the same issue on how the way some commenters describe Muslim terrorism in a way that's over-inclusive, but you say that you're not afraid of the label radical Islam and don't object to it as politically incorrect, but it's factually incorrect, right? That it just as it doesn't adequately describe or it too broadly describes what are very different things. Hamas has some political goals, ISIS has different political goals, Al-Qaeda different, Hezbollah different, and that label can kind of confuse things, much less once you get down to the individual level, as the subjects of the investigations that you've worked, where they all come with different motivations as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. For starters, yes, I wholeheartely believe that radical Islam's undoing will be those fault lines between the different groups, all the different radical factions. You're absolutely right, and I do point that out in the book. And as far as if you want me to elaborate on the term radical Islam and whether or not it's politically correct, I'm not a politician, Mike. I'm not pretending to be politically correct. I am a Muslim American, and I can honestly tell you I'm not offended by that term. I really don't care what they call it. You can call them savages that are twisting a religion. You can call them anything and everything, but the truth of the matter is, spending all this time discussing, their label is taking away from what they actually are. Who cares what we call them? What we need as a nation is to understand the fundamental differences between those groups, between radical Islam and the true tenets of the religion, and that is the only way to defeat them, to beat and win the global war on terror. We must first have to understand them.
Right, and you say specifically the problems start when every Muslim gets painted with the jihadi brush. Jihadis are using a peaceful religion to further their agenda. That's not religious, that's political. And I think that's very well said.
Thank you, sir.
So if you don't mind, let's talk about the case, the major case that you discuss in the book. Is a case that was prosecuted in Canada. And I'll let you tell the story, but I'm really interested in what you called the bump. And we can get into that as you tell the story. But why don't you go ahead and give the viewers just an idea of what that case was about and how you got involved in it.
Sure. Again, the program that I was working, where I was working as an undercover, had been, at this stage, 2012, primarily all national security cases that I was working across the country and overseas. And when this case came around, it was a Montreal resident who was clearly talking to some really bad people overseas, known Al-Qaeda people. And he had 2 trips to Iran back to back in 2 consecutive years. So there was a bunch of red flags and indicators there that suggested this individual might pose a threat. So he had a conference scheduled in California. So the FBI asked if I could get in front of him and quote unquote take his temperature, just to kind of get a feel for who he is, his ideology, and whether or not he actually poses a threat. And that's when you refer to is the bump. And the bump is a casual meeting that's meant to look casual and accidental in an effort to insert my persona, my legend that I have crafted into this individual's life.
And you describe it in such an interesting way, and I thought described in a microcosm what undercover work was, where there was meticulous planning that fell apart almost immediately, and you had to work by the seat of your pants to make it work when somebody was sitting in your seat on the airplane.
Oh, absolutely, and you know from experience as well, Mike, that the best laid plans of mice and men, right?
Right.
You can craft an intricate plan, a game plan. You can have an ops plan. You can lay it all out, but at the end of the day, real life happens. Recorders don't work. Surveillance gets lost. Mistakes will happen. It's human nature. You have to be prepared for that. So I like to craft more of a lesson outline and let the subject dictate which way I'm going to go. And in this particular case, yes, there was a mix-up. There was a legitimate mix-up, but it worked to my favor because, again, unlike a criminal subject, he was ideological subject. He saw someone who looks like him and was hoping talked like him, and was rewarded when he approached me himself by a an individual that could speak to him in his foreign tongue.
And originally it was supposed to be a very short involvement, and you were going to go back to your other cases. You were just, as you said, taking his temperature. But that changed pretty quickly, partly because of the good work that you did in establishing a strong bond with him.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'd love to sit here and tell you that I am a brilliant undercover and it was all my mastermind play. But the truth is simply this. When I pushed him away that week, when he tried to recruit me, it wasn't because I was using some wonderful, masterful technique. I was busy. I had 6 other cases, and in my mind, he was Canada's problem, and I did my job. I basically am confident that he is a danger and that I was going to give them my report so that they can follow up on it. I didn't think I'd ever see him again. So it wasn't anything brilliant on my part. It just worked out that way. Looking back on it now, of course, when someone tries to recruit you to do something criminal or evil and you push them away, that obviously led him to believe in one of the other reasons that I wasn't governed.
Right. It sort of works against type, where they think, oh, if this person, they have a profile of what they think a government infiltrator will look like, and when you don't show them that profile, it works against them. I found the same thing in my cases.
Yes.
So how did it turn into a major operation?
Well, Shihab and I developed that relationship during that week. And like I mentioned before, I thought I'd never see him again. But apparently we maintained relationship throughout the rest of the summer. I met him in June of 2012. We talked regularly on the phone. We emailed. But I figured that was just me keeping up with appearances. Mm-hmm. And intelligence was received that he was traveling to Toronto to go on a fishing trip with an unknown individual, a Palestinian individual. So after that so-called fishing trip that was planned, it turned out to be a reconnaissance mission.
And you were pretty sure of that right from the start when you heard about this fishing trip.
Yeah, again, it goes back to the Mujahideen mindset. It's not because I'm anything special or I'm smarter than anybody. Absolutely not. I'll probably make the argument that I'm never the smartest person in any room I walk into. But it's my culture. It's my religion. And it's what I do. So yes, when I'm talking about the Mujahideen mindset, and I spent a good deal of time with Shihab Asagair, I know his rationale. I know his thought process. He brushes his teeth so his teeth stay healthy so he doesn't have to waste time going to a dentist. He eats so he could survive, so he can continue on, as he calls, fi sabilillah, the path of Allah. He doesn't do anything for pleasure. He does everything for necessity to stay on that path of Allah. It's an extremist view that everything he does is on the path of Allah, and the way that he viewed that path of Allah was always with jihad. And that's what separated him. And that's what I tried to explain to CSIS during that meeting in New York.
And that's the Canadian Security Services.
That's correct.
Their version.
Canada's version of CIA.
Right. And it turned out that your intuition was correct, that in fact they weren't fishing, they were on some kind of scouting mission looking for a potential target. How did it... So this is still in Canada. How does an FBI agent get involved in a Canadian investigation?
Well, as you know, pre-9/11, we still had the wall between intelligence and enforcement here in the U.S. The Canadians still have it. I'm not saying our way is better or their way is better. It's just different. But we did have that wall, if you recall, back before 9/11. And that was meant to protect intelligence assets and techniques from the court and discovery. I get it. But at this point, this was just an intelligence operation in Canada, whereas the FBI often wears 2 hats, intelligence and enforcement. So once they realized that this was a reconnaissance mission and they knew that they were looking to blow up a train and derail a train and kill people, it became a law enforcement action in Canada, so they handed it over to the RCMP, and all they could tell them at that point is, here are your two subjects. They are planning a terrorist attack on Canadian soil, and oh, by the way, the leader of the cell, his best friend is an undercover FBI agent in New York. Mm-hmm. That's it. And that's pretty much what the RCMP received, and they had to generate their own investigation and take it from there. And that's when phone calls were made to FBI headquarters, eventually to New York. And once all the protections were met, we were able to quickly get me deployed and operational with all the countermeasures in place.
And viewers or people who read your book might not realize the bureaucratic nightmare that must have been involved. It might be assumed that Canada is a close ally and a neighbor, and that it's easy for an FBI agent to simply operate in Canada, but it's actually not. And cause
actually, yes,
because the law is different. Number one, so I'm sure that there was a lot, and you go into it a little bit in the book how it was a little irregular from the way you were used to operating in the United States.
Absolutely spot on, Mike. And that's, I'm actually looking back on it now, I'm shocked at how quick we were able to get everything done. But that's just a testament to two foreign partners with a common goal in defeating terrorism. But I will say it was the first of its kind, a cross-border law enforcement and intelligence operation that's never happened before in both of our histories. And I'm very proud to have been a part of that. We were able to move really quickly. Initially, it was understood that it was an anniversary attack, so I think it was assumed at some level that the anniversary was 9/11, and mind you, this was Labor Day weekend, so we had about 8 days to act, but it turned out that the anniversary that was interpreted was actually the anniversary of Jesus Christ's birthday, which was the literal translation, and they were actually looking to derail it on Christmas Day.
Interesting. And talk a little bit about the plot that you described.
The plot basically was to derail a train from New York City to Toronto to kill as many American and Canadians as possible. It was supposed to be done over a body of water that was as shallow as possible, so that there was no chance for survival and that everyone on board would die. It was supposed to take place on Christmas Day because they would have had very little light. The plan was to hit a train that was around 7 p.m., so they would be able to start getting the attack in place around 5 p.m. and not be seen, have the cover of darkness. My role was to upload a video that they were going to pre-record to send a message to Americans and Canadians that they are here, they're not leaving. Leave the Muslim-occupied lands, remove your troops from their lands, or this will continue to happen again and again.
And originally, although you had this fast friendship from your plane trip across country, he had another teammate that he had brought onto this plot that was with him when they went to scout the railroad trestle.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, they were the original two. He had known him for quite some time, and they'd been talking about it, but Shahab brought him on well before he brought me on.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think his motivation was?
When you say him, you mean Shahab or you mean Jasser?
Jasser.
Jasser.
So Shahab is the primary subject who you flew with, and then Jasser was somebody you found out about later was a colleague with him looking at this train trestle.
That's correct. Yeah, Jasser is the Palestinian in Toronto who was also extremely evil, was looking to hurt people, but he had a bit of a complex in the sense that he didn't like taking orders from Al-Qaeda senior leadership. He believed that he's been in Canada for 20 years and that he, more than they did, knew how to hurt these people. He had bigger dreams, bigger plans. He had sniper attacks, active shooter type attacks. He wanted to be the leader and call the shots, and he did not like the fact that Shihab was the leader and taking orders from Al-Qaeda senior leadership. So there was a bit of a rift from the get-go, but he was still on board, and he was an active participant in planning to derail that train.
And Shihab was a PhD student.
Correct.
In Canada studying. How much did the work that he was doing in his PhD come into play or raise concerns for you?
Well, he works with infectious diseases in a lab, so obviously his trips to Iran, his conversations online, his motivation was obviously something we needed to figure out quickly because of exactly that. But what fascinates me about Shihab, and honestly was one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book, is a lot of times I hear Americans saying or asking, what radicalizes these people? How does this happen? How do you go from a normal person to that? And we highlight this very well in the book, and I'm very proud of that. Shihab Asghar was, or is, a brilliant scientist, IQ off the charts, on the precipice of curing infectious diseases. And he goes from that to being able to be such a gift to humanity. In 2 years' time, in less than 2 years' time, ends up one step removed from Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda. And that story fascinates me because of the fact that I'm a counterterrorism operative, but I think the world should understand why he did what he did, how he did what he did. And I think that's, again, part of the deep dive into that terrorist mindset, and it's a first step for all of us to really understand our enemy.
And you ended up spending quite a bit of time in Canada, going back and forth between Toronto and Quebec and Montreal with these subjects and others. How did that work out for you? I mean, it must have been difficult understanding how the Canadian system worked. You mentioned one part where they didn't tell you where the cameras were in a room, which if that was true when I was undercover, I would have been quite upset about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, with your experience, you understand we like to be behind the scenes. I will walk into a SCIF, a secret compartmented information facility, and get all the classified information I need. But to do the job that we did, Mike, it's you need that pattern of life, that human stuff. So we want a full dump on our subjects. Nothing was off limits to us. And it was our job as professional undercovers to be able to put up a wall from the law enforcement side to the undercover side. And that was on us. And that was a switch that we had to flip internally. So when you go to Canada, and again, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, it's just different. And I understand why they do it that way, but undercovers are treated differently in the sense that they're not given anything behind the scenes because they don't want them to react to it as if they already know it. They don't want them to try to finagle a room because they know where the cameras are. They want everything to be natural. And I get it, but it's just not anything I was ever used to. So clearly I was a little offended when I wasn't told the things that I would normally be told. So yes.
Right. I mean, that's the way I looked at it. The more information I had, the better decisions I could make when something inevitably went awry. So if I didn't have the right information, I could make a mistake that could have easily been avoided.
That's exactly how I feel. And I understand how they do it, but that's not how I worked for my entire career.
And it comes into play in one other short story in your book where I used to explain to people that the subject, the target of the investigation, was not really the undercover agent's natural enemy, because you could work with that person. It was the tech agents, the agents who put the microphones together and the different recording devices and cameras that were the natural enemy of the undercover agent, because they so often wouldn't work or have some kind of problem. And somebody decided that a good way to record conversations in a car would be to rig up a GPS machine with some kind of device. But how did that go wrong?
Well, we actually don't go into the specifics of what the equipment was in the book for obvious reasons, but I will tell you that apparently there's this one section in Montreal that's extremely industrial, electrical lines and all kinds of stuff going on, and I managed to go to the one place on Earth that somehow, some way reversed the polarity of said equipment so that I actually heard my cover team, and it became more of a receiver than a transmitter. So yes, that was, my heart dropped. I think it was maybe 3, maybe 4 seconds tops, but it felt like a minute.
Yeah, I can imagine. And reading it, I had chills thinking about how quickly you would have to respond, and you were able to turn the machine off very quickly. But then you were left without a GPS device and got lost.
Yeah, I probably should have blamed it on something other than my GPS. You're right. Yeah. But I think the telltale thing there is, yeah, that's what we do. We're all trained to react and expect the unexpected. But the thing in that particular situation that was a little disheartening was he was on his way out of the car. So I didn't have the opportunity to read his body language after the snafu. So I probably would have felt a lot more comfortable if I could see that he came down. But his hair went up and he got out of the car, and that was it until later that night.
And that's always the hard thing is there's so much, no matter how much work you do behind the scenes, there's so much you don't know about what's going on in a person's head and where some small mistake might have been your undoing. Talk a little bit about as the team that Shihab was putting together was expanding, or what your concerns about its possible expansion were.
Regarding all the recruitment he was doing?
Right, and particularly, I understand there was an American he kept talking about.
Oh, yes. Again, we were up there to stop a terrorist plot. It was what we do. It's what the FBI, the RCMP, the intelligence agency, that's our job. Obviously, that's what I was happy to do. But what kind of gave me a pit in my stomach that floored me was during the conversation and the car ride, the 6-hour car ride from Montreal to Toronto, where I was going to meet Jasser, the other conspirator in this plot. Shihab revealed to me that there was an individual that trained in Iran prior to him, that his trainer, who he referred to as Al-Mas'ul, always called Al-Amriki, which means the American. And he said that somewhat in passing, and I got a huge pit in my stomach, and I asked him, I said, Shihab, what do you mean? And I asked him to elaborate, and he revealed to me that there is a version of him in the United States, but he's sleeping right now. He's an American sleeper. So right then and there, on the heels of it being September 11th, there was a ton of emotion. I was there with a bunch of guys from the New York division, my team, the case agents, everyone. So this hit home with us, obviously, because the investigation just took on a whole new face for us.
Mm. And but the Canadians were interested in wrapping this case up. They had enough evidence, they thought, to charge Shihab and Jasser. How did that impact you and the investigation that you now wanted to conduct in the United States?
Well, at the time, obviously, all of us, the grunts on the ground, the case agents, my contact agent, Joey, Nellie, the guys that were intimately involved in this investigation, we didn't want it to end. We had a platform set up to vet threats on both sides of the border. We were ready to keep it going. But yes, was I upset that the Canadians wanted to pull the trigger? Yeah, of course at the time, but if you step back from it now and you look at it, the Canadian investigation, for all intents and purposes, was wrapped up in about 3.5 weeks in September of 2012. They had what they needed for successful prosecution. We didn't take this case down until April 22nd, 2013. They gave us over 7 additional months to continue our investigation, to draw the intel out of Shahab's brain, to make our connections overseas, to do what we could to identify the American sleeper. But on the heels of the Boston Marathon bombing and what, a few other political issues that were taking place, I understand why they wrapped it up. I didn't want it to end. We didn't want it to end. But I understand why it ended.
And obviously the Boston Marathon bombing must have made everybody think, we don't want to wait one day too late in any case. But you mentioned other political reasons, and there was actually a piece of legislation going through the Canadian legislature that is referred to as the Canadian Patriot Act. And you mentioned in the book that this case provided some of the maybe justification for passing that, and it passed quickly after the arrests were made public.
Yeah, and that's how it happened. I don't know if that was the motivation. We can all speculate, all day long. But unfortunately, sometimes politics finds its way into law enforcement, and it is what it is. But I get it. I just wasn't happy with it. That's all.
And so the arrests are made, you're going back to work in other cases and not figuring that you're going to testify, but they need you. How did that work for you, and what were your concerns, and how were they addressed?
Well, as you know, Mike, terrorism cases rarely go to trial, especially when you have the type of evidence that we have. So I thought that was it. Abbasi and I got arrested in New York, another individual in this investigation, and Shahab got arrested in Montreal, and Jasser got arrested in Toronto. I figured that was that. I got to the undercover apartment, spent the night there, and went about my business after that. Several months later, I received a subpoena from the Royal Crown telling me that I have to testify in this case. And all my fears came back as to why we were worried about doing this cross-border law enforcement operation, because the protections that I have here in the U.S., my country protects my identity every step of the way in the legal process, so that my identity would never be revealed, so I can continue to do the work that I do. Mm-hmm. But we weren't sure that the Canadian courts would see it that way. And we also knew that I didn't really have a choice, and I had to testify, because not just are they an ally, but they needed me to testify in order to put them away. So the National Security Law Branch argued successfully with the Royal Crown to get me the same protections, and the Canadians went above and beyond the call of duty. They protected my identity. They gave me a security detail that was second to none. Private planes flew me in and out of the country. I didn't have to worry about biometrics. They cleared the courtroom. Only essential personnel and FBI and RCMP people in the courtroom. They took the media out of the courtroom and did CCTV for them to see everything but me. They weren't allowed to record my voice. Every protection order was met, and I was able to testify for over 3 weeks on the stand, and thankfully get guilty verdicts, and they are now serving life sentences.
And Shahab chose to represent himself, as I understand it. What was the interaction with him like in the courtroom?
Well, there was the first time I saw him upon walking into the courtroom, and he gave me the blankest stare I've ever gotten in my life. I've testified many times before in court in drug cases and other types of cases, but never in a terrorism case, and never one that I've established this length of a relationship with someone. So it struck me. Obviously, I didn't know how to feel at that moment, but I wasn't comfortable with the stare. I wanted him to look angry. I wanted him to look away or laugh at me, something. But it was too blank of a stare that kind of spooked me. And then I look over to him, right next to him, and it's Jasser. He was leaning forward, and he couldn't wait to make eye contact with me. And he looked around the room to make sure no one was looking, and he mouthed to me, "I will find you." Mm. And it was right at that moment that it took me back to my drug days, and I felt so much more at ease after that. He calmed me down, and I was ready to get started.
Now, at the end of the trial, you had described quite a bit of fairly bizarre behavior that Shihab was involved in during the course of the investigation, but apparently some of his courtroom antics caused the judge to order a psychiatric exam that came back and said that he was schizophrenic and possibly psychotic. How were you aware of that at the time, or were you already gone? And how did that have you looked back at some of his actions and maybe looked at them differently?
No, I will say this. I'm going to tread lightly on his mental state simply because, as you know, there's appeals coming up.
Okay.
But I will say this much. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind, Mike, that he knew right from wrong. Mm-hmm. He knew to take countermeasures, counter surveillance. His operational security was second to none in the sense that he would make me take batteries out of my phone, shut phones down, circle the block. He's always eyeing anybody up that's near us. He questioned another undercover I brought in, interrogated him almost, to make sure that he was one of us. He understood that what we were doing, quote unquote, was killing people, and that even by his own admission, when I pretended to have some remorse about doing this, and I wasn't sure, I wanted him to explain to me, and he went on to give me a 22-minute soliloquy about the justifications and rationalizations of taking innocent lives. He justified them religiously in his mind, in his warped views, and he justified them scientifically. And I highlight that in the chapter, the Christian burial speech. And it's imperative that anybody can say anything after the fact and say, well, I was this, yes, I was that. Being quirky and knowing right from wrong, I'll leave the courts to decide. I'll leave it to the courts to decide whether you're not legally or whatever. That's on them. But I'm going to tell you right now, my opinion, he absolutely knew what he was doing.
And obviously, it doesn't take a genius to do harm to people. So I'm just wondering where there were references to, in particular, there was a reference to, you mentioned El Mosul, and he pointed at a FBI wanted poster, which was a neat trick that your case agent suggested to you, and identified somebody. But that person was not an Iranian, but actually a Palestinian who was involved with the Abu Nidal organization back in the 1980s. How did you think about that?
I honestly believe that, now mind you, before Shihab saw that picture and before Nellie, the case agent, had the brilliant idea of putting those pictures in front of him. Essentially, we did a photo lineup in an undercover capacity.
Right, that was brilliant. It really was.
Yeah, it really was brilliant, and it's something I would have never thought about. And when Nellie suggested it at the safe house, at first, my knee-jerk reaction was like, we can't do that. And then after we digested it, he was spot on, and not only did it worked brilliantly. But before Shihab saw his picture, you have to understand something, Mike. He described him to me because we were still trying to figure out who he was before Nellie came up with this idea. He described the scar under his left eye. He told me, essentially, that he was 47 years old, okay? And this is 2012, and he was born in 1965. He told me that he wasn't from Iran, but he only spoke these languages to him. He described his hair, his eyes, his build, his background, everything that was in there except for place of birth. And the only thing he said that doesn't make sense is because he didn't speak Arabic, he spoke Farsi. And that was his reason. And basically his rationale there as a scientist is every Palestinian speaks Arabic. And he's right, they do. But so again, that's why I wholeheartedly believe when he snapped and his reaction, he looked at that face, yeah, that was him.
Yeah. And there was one last person who you just mentioned briefly, Ahmed Abbasi, and that case, well, describe what happened in that case that it didn't get all that you were hoping for.
Yeah, well, basically that Abbasi, we found out during the course of the investigation, was essentially Shahab Essegayer's radicalizer. He was from Quebec City, another brilliant engineer who was studying nuclear engineering, yet another scary field to have this type of mindset. And when of probably, I don't know, a dozen people that Shahab had put me in front of, I was probably safe to say none of them were even remotely a threat in my professional opinion. When he put me in front of Abbasi, that was a different animal. He had that look and the speech, the rhetoric, the hatred, and the evil in his eyes. And I was excited to peel those layers back.
And just didn't have the time, or?
Well, we did have the time. I reported to my handlers at the time, both sides, the U.S. and Canada, what I suspected that Abbasi was. And when he traveled to Tunisia, the Canadians revoked his visa so that he couldn't come back because they felt like, okay, if he's a threat, well then, we don't need him here. That's all well and good.
And Tamer, it's been wonderful talking to you, and I appreciate you writing the book. I think there's a lot in there for all of us to learn. And let's just make clear that Ahmed Abbasi was not convicted of any terrorism-related charges. He was convicted of, you know better than I do.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was he? He was convicted on a visa fraud charge. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was visa fraud. He was initially charged with terrorism-related visa fraud charges, but he was eventually pled to lesser charges and deported. That's correct.
Okay, great. Well, Tamer, I wish you luck as you continue your career. I'm sure you'll be very much in demand, and if there's anything else that you'd like to say, this is your moment. I'm sure you'll have more, but before you go back undercover.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I would love, just to echo the sentiments of my book, and I hope many Americans get an opportunity to read it, and will echo my sentiments. Regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, it doesn't matter. This is more about humanity. It's more about our country, our nation being united as opposed to divided. I wholeheartedly believe that what makes America great is the fact that we truly are everyone. We are every race, religion, ethnicity. And like I said earlier, when we are threatened by an enemy, chances are we have someone that looks like them or sounds like them to help defeat them. Education and inclusion are our best defense. Thanks a lot, Mike. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to view other Afterwards programs online, simply